My name is William Thompson, and I'm 56 years old. I've lived in Pine Valley, Colorado my whole life, and I thought I knew everyone in this small town of 25,000 people. But last Tuesday morning at 6:15, I got a phone call from the Pine Valley Police Department that shattered everything I believed about trust and family. They told me there had been a drowning incident at the Colorado River, and they needed me to come down immediately. The victim was my best friend since high school, Darryl Peterson. When I arrived at the scene, something wasn't right about what they found. Before I tell you what really happened that morning, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever felt something was off about a situation. Subscribe for more real stories from small-town America, and stick around, because what the divers found underwater will change everything you think you know about family loyalty. Pine Valley sits along the Colorado River, surrounded by mountains that have watched over our community for generations. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your name, your business, and your family history, going back 3 generations. The autumn leaves were just beginning to change colors, that October tainting the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds that drew tourists from across the state. Darryl Peterson was 68 years old when this happened, a man who embodied everything good about small-town values. He had been the president of First National Bank of Pine Valley for 32 years before retiring 5 years ago. During his tenure, he helped countless families secure home loans, saved struggling businesses with creative financing solutions, and never foreclosed on a property without exhausting every possible alternative first. The man I knew was gentle, generous, and always willing to lend a helping hand to anyone in need. Every Christmas, Darryl anonymously paid off layaway accounts for struggling families at the local department store. He organized charity drives for the food bank, coached Little League Baseball for 20 years, and never missed a Sunday service at Pine Valley Community Church, where he served as a deacon. Darryl was a widower who had lost his beloved wife, Sarah, to breast cancer 3 years earlier. Sarah's death hit him like a freight train, and for months afterward, he seemed lost without his partner of 43 years. She had been the love of his life, his best friend, and the anchor that kept him grounded through decades of community service and business responsibilities. After Sarah passed, Darryl lived alone in the 2-story Victorian house on Maple Street that he and Sarah had bought as newlyweds in 1979. The house held 4 decades of memories in every room. Sarah's garden still bloomed each spring with the perennials she had planted, and Darryl tended them with the devotion of a man keeping sacred ground. But everything changed 8 months ago when Jessica moved back home with her 2 children, Emma, who was 7, and little Michael, who was 5. Jessica Peterson had been living in Denver with her ex-husband, Marcus, until their divorce became final in February. The split was messy and expensive, involving custody battles, property disputes, and allegations of infidelity that left Jessica emotionally and financially devastated. She was 32 years old, a former marketing coordinator at a Denver advertising agency who had been out of work since the divorce proceedings began consuming her time and energy. When she asked to move back home to Pine Valley, Darryl welcomed her and the grandchildren with open arms, believing that family should always support each other through difficult times. I had known Jessica since she was a baby, watched her take her first steps in my backyard during a neighborhood barbecue, cheered at her high school graduation, where she was valedictorian, and danced at her wedding to Marcus 7 years ago. She had always been a bright, ambitious young woman with dreams of building a successful marketing career in the big city. But the Jessica who moved back home was different from the confident woman who had left Pine Valley after college. The stress of the divorce, the financial pressure of legal bills, and the responsibility of raising 2 children as a single mother had changed her in ways that worried everyone who knew her. She seemed constantly on edge, quick to anger over minor inconveniences, and obsessed with money in a way that felt unhealthy. Darryl confided in me during our weekly coffee meetings at Harper's Diner that Jessica seemed perpetually anxious about financial matters. She would approach him several times a week, asking for help with groceries, utilities, car payments, medical expenses, and school supplies for the children. Being the loving father and grandfather he was, Darryl never hesitated to help, wanting his daughter and grandchildren to feel secure during this difficult transition. But over the months that followed, I noticed troubling changes in Darryl's demeanor and appearance. The man who used to greet everyone with a warm smile and a friendly joke seemed more withdrawn and contemplative. He appeared tired during our conversations, with dark circles under his eyes and a distracted quality that was completely unlike his usual attentive nature. 3 days before the incident, I met Darryl at Harper's Diner for our usual Tuesday morning coffee at 8:30. The restaurant was nearly empty, except for a few farmers discussing crop prices at the corner booth and old Martha Henderson working on her crossword puzzle by the window. Darryl looked exhausted, with deep lines etched around his eyes and an expression I had never seen before in 50 years of friendship. When I asked how he was doing, he hesitated for a long moment, stirring sugar into his coffee with unusual deliberation, before telling me about his growing concerns regarding Jessica's increasingly frequent financial requests. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he kept glancing around the diner as if afraid someone might overhear our conversation. Darryl explained that Jessica's business plan seemed vague and constantly changing whenever he asked for specific details. First, she claimed she wanted to sell handmade crafts online through social media platforms. Then it was vintage clothing sourced from thrift stores, then handmade jewelry made from recycled materials. Every time he asked reasonable questions about her business model, target market, or financial projections, she would become defensive and accuse him of not trusting her judgment as an adult. The $35,000 wasn't the only money Jessica had requested from his retirement savings. Over the past several months, she had asked for smaller amounts that totaled nearly $15,000 for various supposedly urgent expenses. Car repairs that seemed to happen every few weeks, medical bills for the children that insurance supposedly wouldn't cover, school supplies that cost hundreds of dollars, emergency situations that always seemed to arise at the most convenient times. What troubled Darryl most deeply was his recent discovery of several unpaid bills hidden underneath Jessica's mattress when he was helping 7-year-old Emma look for a lost stuffed animal. The bills weren't for utilities, medical expenses, or legitimate household costs, as Jessica had claimed when asking for money. They were payment notices and debt collection letters from online gambling websites, credit card companies that specialized in cash advances, and payday loan services with interest rates that bordered on predatory. The amounts were staggering and represented a level of debt that Jessica had never mentioned during any of their conversations about her financial struggles. The gambling debts alone totaled over $40,000, spread across multiple online casinos and sports betting platforms. The credit card balances showed a pattern of cash advances being immediately transferred to gambling accounts, creating a devastating cycle of debt accumulation. That Tuesday morning at Harper's Diner, Darryl told me about confronting Jessica about the hidden bills the previous evening. She initially denied everything, claiming the bills were old statements from before her marriage ended, and that she had already resolved those debts as part of her divorce settlement. But when Darryl showed her the recent dates on all the statements, which were all from the past 3 months, she broke down and admitted to having developed a serious problem with online gambling. I had witnessed one of their arguments the previous week at Morrison's grocery store while shopping for my wife's birthday dinner ingredients. I was in the produce section selecting vegetables when I heard raised voices from the cereal aisle. Jessica was demanding that Darryl withdraw more money from his savings account, immediately claiming she needed it for Emma's upcoming school trip to the state capital. When Darryl gently suggested they discuss the expense at home, where they could review the school paperwork together, Jessica's voice grew louder and more aggressive. She accused him of being selfish and uncaring about his grandchildren's educational opportunities and social development. The words that stuck with me were when Jessica said, "You're sitting on all that money while your family suffers. What kind of grandfather puts money before his grandchildren's happiness?" The pain and confusion on Darryl's face was heartbreaking to witness. Here was a man who had spent his entire life helping others, who had given generously to countless causes and individuals, being accused of selfishness by the daughter he loved more than anything in the world. He clearly wanted to provide for his family, but was beginning to understand that his generosity might be enabling destructive behavior rather than helping solve Jessica's problems. During our coffee meeting, Darryl shared additional disturbing discoveries about Jessica's daily activities and behavior patterns. He had found evidence that she was placing online bets every single day, sometimes multiple times per day, using the library's computers when she claimed to be job searching. The gambling websites showed a pattern of increasingly larger stakes and devastating losses that followed the classic addiction pattern of chasing losses with bigger bets. What started as $20 bets on sports games had escalated to several $100s per session on online slot machines and poker games. Jessica was caught in the downward spiral of gambling addiction, where each loss convinced her that the next bet would be the big win that solved all her problems. Instead, each bet dug her deeper into debt and desperation. The night before the incident, I was awakened at 11:30 by loud shouting coming from the Peterson house next door. The houses on Maple Street were built in the 1920s, when lots were smaller and neighbors lived closer together, so sound carried easily through the old single-pane windows that most of us still had in our bedrooms. I could clearly hear Jessica's voice, filled with anger and desperation, rising above Darryl's calmer but increasingly firm responses. The argument seemed to move from room to room throughout the house, with Jessica's voice growing more intense and hostile, while Darryl's responses became shorter and more decisive. Although I couldn't make out every word through the walls, the tone was unmistakably aggressive from Jessica's side. Through my bedroom window, I could see lights turning on and off in different rooms of the Peterson house as the argument progressed. The confrontation appeared to start in the kitchen, move to the living room, then up to the second floor, where Jessica's bedroom was located. At one point, I heard what sounded like furniture being moved, or possibly thrown, followed by Jessica's voice reaching a level of intensity that was genuinely frightening. At approximately midnight, I heard Jessica scream words that chilled me to the bone. "You're ruining my life, old man. You don't understand what I'm going through. I need that money, and I need it now." The venom and desperation in her voice was shocking. This was not the loving daughter asking for help from a caring father, but someone whose desperation had transformed into rage, and possibly something more dangerous. Darryl's response was too quiet for me to hear clearly, but whatever he said triggered an even more explosive reaction from Jessica. She began making what sounded like threats and ultimatums, her voice carrying clearly across the narrow space between our houses. I heard her mention taking the children and leaving Pine Valley forever, never letting Darryl see his beloved grandchildren again, if he didn't provide the money she desperately needed for her gambling debts. The manipulation was transparent, even from my position next door, and my heart ached for what Darryl must be experiencing. He was being forced to choose between enabling his daughter's destructive addiction and losing contact with Emma and Michael, the two people who had brought joy back into his life after Sarah's death. Jessica was weaponizing his love for the grandchildren against him in the cruelest possible way. Around 12:45 in the morning, I heard a door slam with such violence that my own windows rattled, followed immediately by the sound of Jessica's car starting and driving away at high speed down Maple Street. The sudden silence that followed was almost more disturbing than the argument itself. I considered going over to check on Darryl's well-being, but decided to wait until morning to avoid intruding on such an intensely personal family crisis. I lay awake for another hour, listening for any sounds from the Peterson house, but heard nothing. The silence felt ominous rather than peaceful, and I found myself worrying about Darryl's emotional state after such a brutal confrontation with his daughter. I made a mental note to call him first thing in the morning to offer support or simply listen if he needed to talk about what had happened. Unable to sleep, I spent the remaining hours until dawn thinking about the changes I had observed in both Darryl and Jessica over the past several months. The signs of Jessica's gambling addiction had been there for anyone paying attention, but none of us had recognized them for what they were. Her constant financial emergencies, her mood swings, her increasing isolation from friends and family members, all pointed to someone struggling with a serious addiction. At 7:15 the next morning, I called Darryl's landline, hoping to offer support or just check on his well-being after the previous night's traumatic argument. The phone rang 8 times before going to voicemail, which was unusual because Darryl was always awake early and typically answered his phone promptly. I left a message saying I was concerned about him and asking him to call me back when he had a chance to talk. By 8:30, I was getting ready for my usual morning walk around the neighborhood when I noticed Jessica's car pulling into the Peterson driveway. She moved quickly from her vehicle to the house carrying what appeared to be a large bag or suitcase. What struck me as highly unusual was that Emma and Michael were not with her, even though it was already past their normal departure time for school. Jessica always took the children to Pine Valley Elementary every weekday morning at 8:15 sharp. She was compulsive about their school attendance and morning routine, often mentioning to neighbors how important consistency was for children from divorced homes. The absence of the children that morning felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate, but it added to my growing sense of unease. Jessica spent only about 20 minutes inside the house before emerging again. This time she was empty-handed and moving even more urgently toward her car than when she had arrived. She kept looking around nervously, as if checking to see if any neighbors were watching her activities. When she spotted me in my front yard getting the newspaper, she quickly averted her gaze and drove away without the customary wave or friendly greeting we had always exchanged. The complete change in Jessica's normal behavior troubled me deeply. In all the months she had been living with Darryl, she had never left for any destination without Emma and Michael during school hours. The children were her constant companions whenever she went shopping to appointments or anywhere else during the day. She had always been a devoted and attentive mother, despite her other problems. By 9:30, I decided to walk over and check on Darryl's well-being after the traumatic argument I had overheard. I knocked on the front door several times and called his name loudly but received no response. His car was not in the driveway or visible anywhere on the street, which was unusual because Darryl rarely drove anywhere early in the morning before 10 o'clock. His daily routine was predictable and rarely varied coffee on the front porch while reading the Pine Valley Gazette, tending to Sarah's flower garden, and then possibly running errands or visiting friends later in the morning. The idea of him leaving the house before 9 o'clock was completely out of character, especially after such a difficult night with Jessica. I walked around to the back of the house and found the kitchen door slightly ajar, which was completely out of character for Darryl's meticulous attention to home security. Since Sarah's death, he had become even more careful about locking doors and windows, often checking them multiple times before going to bed. I called his name several times through the open door, but heard no response from inside the house. Darryl's house slippers were still sitting in their usual place by the front door, suggesting he had left the house without putting on proper footwear. This was another detail that felt wrong, because Darryl was fastidious about his appearance and would never go anywhere, even briefly, without being fully dressed, including appropriate shoes. Growing increasingly worried about my friend's safety and well-being, I called the Pine Valley Police Department to request a welfare check. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, including the argument I had overheard and the unusual circumstances of Darryl's apparent absence. Officer Martinez arrived within 15 minutes and accompanied me through a preliminary search of the house and immediate neighborhood. Everything appeared normal inside the Peterson house, with no signs of struggle disturbance or anything that suggested violence had occurred. Darryl's wallet, car keys, and reading glasses were all in their usual places on the kitchen counter. His coffee cup was still on the front porch table, half full and cold, suggesting he had been interrupted during his normal morning routine. Officer Martinez suggested we systematically check all the places Darryl frequented during his typical daily activities. We drove to the Pine Valley Public Library, where he volunteered twice a week, the post office, where he collected mail for several elderly neighbors, and Harper's Diner, where he often had lunch with other retirees. None of the staff at any of these locations had seen Darryl that morning. It was Officer Martinez who suggested we check the parking area near the Colorado River, a peaceful spot about 2 miles from downtown, where Darryl sometimes went to think, read, and enjoy the natural surroundings that reminded him of fishing trips he had taken with Sarah during their marriage. The location held special meaning for him as a place of reflection and connection with memories of his late wife. When we arrived at the riverside parking area at approximately 11:45, we immediately spotted Darryl's blue Honda Accord parked in the shade of a large cottonwood tree near the water's edge. The car was properly locked, and through the windows we could see Darryl's lightweight jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat, along with his bookmark and the hardcover novel he had been reading. Officer Martinez immediately radioed for backup and requested the Pine Valley Fire Department's dive team, explaining that we had a possible drowning situation that required immediate response. He began securing the scene while I stood by the car, hoping against hope that Darryl might simply be taking a long walk along the riverbank and would return safely. Within 30 minutes, the peaceful riverside location was transformed into a scene of intense emergency activity. The Pine Valley Fire Department's dive team arrived with their specialized equipment, followed by paramedics, additional police officers, and Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who took charge of coordinating the search efforts while documenting everything for a potential investigation. The Colorado River at this particular location was approximately 40 feet wide and 12 feet deep in the center channel where the current was strongest. The water was moderately murky from recent autumn rains in the mountains, making visibility challenging for the divers, but not impossible for an experienced team that practiced regularly in similar conditions. I watched from the shore as the dive team methodically searched the river bottom using a grid pattern that ensured complete coverage of the most likely areas. The first diver, Tony Garcia, who I knew from his volunteer work with the fire department, emerged after 20 minutes of searching and shook his head to indicate he hadn't found anything in the initial search zone. The team expanded their search area downstream working systematically to cover nearly 200 yards of riverbank and the associated underwater areas. The current was moderate but steady, flowing toward the larger confluence about 2 miles downstream, where the Colorado River joined with Pine Creek. If someone had entered the water upstream, the current would have carried them in that direction. After 6 hours of intensive searching at approximately 3:45 in the afternoon, the divers found Darryl's body lodged against a fallen cottonwood tree trunk about 150 yards downstream from where his car was parked. The recovery process was complicated due to the position of the body and the strength of the current at that location, requiring all 3 divers working together to safely bring him to shore. What immediately struck everyone present as highly unusual was Darryl's clothing and overall appearance. He was wearing his blue striped pajamas, terry cloth bathrobe, and bedroom slippers, as if he had left his house in the middle of the night or very early morning without getting properly dressed. This was completely inconsistent with his lifelong habits and meticulous attention to personal appearance. During the careful recovery process, the divers made a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about what had happened to Darryl. His cell phone was still in the right pocket of his bathrobe, protected by a waterproof case that Sarah had given him for his birthday 2 years earlier, when he started taking morning walks near the river. The phone was still functional despite being underwater for several hours, and when Detective Rodriguez checked the call log and message history, she found something that made her immediately call for the coroner and crime scene investigators. The discovery transformed what had initially appeared to be a tragic accident or possible suicide into something far more sinister and heartbreaking. The last text message in Darryl's phone was sent to my number at 2:17 in the morning, just hours before his body was found. The message read, "William, if something happens to me, check my safe. The combination is Sarah's birthday. Trust no one else with this information. I'm sorry for everything that's about to unfold." The timestamp placed this message in the middle of the argument I had overheard between Darryl and Jessica. Detective Rodriguez asked me about the safe Darryl had mentioned, but I had no knowledge of any safe or secure storage area in his house. She obtained legal permission to conduct a thorough search of the Peterson residence, and I accompanied her as Darryl's designated emergency contact, a responsibility he had given me after Sarah's death when he updated all his legal documents. We searched every room systematically, looking for any kind of safe lockbox or secure storage area that might contain the information Darryl had referenced in his final text message. The search took nearly 2 hours, examining closets, checking behind furniture, and looking for any signs of a hidden compartment or security device. The safe was finally located behind a large framed photograph of Sarah that hung in Darryl's bedroom above his dresser. It was a small fireproof document box about the size of a briefcase that had been built into the wall behind the picture frame. Sarah's birthday. October 15th, 1954, opened the digital lock on the first attempt. Inside the safe, we discovered documents and evidence that painted a devastating picture of what had been happening in the Peterson household during the months leading up to Darryl's death. The contents revealed a level of planning and forethought that suggested Darryl had been preparing for the possibility that his life might be in danger from his own daughter. The most significant item was a handwritten will dated just 5 days before his death that completely changed the distribution of his estate. Unlike his previous will that left everything to Jessica, this new document left the majority of his assets to various charity organizations and established substantial trust funds for Emma and Michael's education that Jessica could not access or control. Jessica was left only $5,000 in cash, and the contents of her mother's jewelry box a dramatic reduction from the several $100,000 she had expected to inherit. The will included a detailed explanation of Darryl's reasoning, citing Jessica's gambling addiction and financial irresponsibility as factors that made her unsuitable to manage a large inheritance. More shocking was a small digital recording device containing multiple audio files that Darryl had secretly made of his conversations with Jessica over the past several weeks. In these recordings, we heard Jessica's increasingly desperate and angry demands for money, followed by explicit threats against Darryl's physical safety if he continued to refuse her requests for access to his retirement accounts. The most damning evidence was a security camera system that I had forgotten about entirely. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down from the Petersons on Maple Street, had installed a comprehensive security system after experiencing a break in 6 months earlier. Her main camera had a wide-angle view that captured part of the Peterson driveway and the street directly in front of their house. Detective Rodriguez obtained permission to review Mrs. Henderson's security footage from the night of the incident. At 5:14 in the morning, we watched in horror as Jessica pushed a wheelchair containing her father from the house toward her car. Darryl appeared to be unconscious or heavily sedated, his head lolling to one side as Jessica maneuvered the wheelchair down the front steps and along the driveway. The security footage provided a timeline that revealed the calculated nature of Jessica's actions. We watched her struggle for nearly 10 minutes to transfer her unconscious father from the wheelchair into the passenger seat of her car. Throughout this process, Darryl showed no signs of consciousness resistance or awareness of what was happening to him. Jessica then loaded the wheelchair into her car and drove away, returning exactly 47 minutes later without either the wheelchair or her father. During her return, she appeared agitated and nervous, constantly looking around as if afraid someone might be watching her activities. The footage clearly showed her disposing of something in the garbage bin before entering the house. With this overwhelming evidence, Detective Rodriguez immediately issued an arrest warrant for Jessica Peterson on charges of murder, elder abuse, and theft. I volunteered to help locate her, knowing that she might attempt to flee Pine Valley with the children, or in her desperation potentially harm Emma and Michael to prevent them from becoming witnesses to her crimes. We discovered that Jessica had taken the children to her sister Linda's house in Grand Junction, telling Linda that Darryl had suffered a heart attack during the night and was in the intensive care unit at Denver General Hospital. Linda had immediately offered to care for Emma and Michael, while Jessica dealt with the medical emergency, having no reason to doubt her sister's story. I accompanied Detective Rodriguez and 2 other officers on the drive to Grand Junction, where we found Jessica frantically packing suitcases and preparing to leave with the children. She had already loaded several bags into her car and was telling Linda that she needed to take Emma and Michael to California, where Darryl could receive specialized treatment not available in Colorado. When Jessica saw the police cars pulling into Linda's driveway, her composure completely collapsed. She immediately began crying and shaking while Linda stood in confusion, trying to understand why police officers were arresting her sister for a crime she couldn't comprehend. The arrest was heartbreaking to witness, especially with Emma and Michael present, and unable to understand what was happening to their mother. Jessica alternately tried to maintain her innocence and became hysterical as the reality of her situation became clear. She initially claimed that Darryl had wandered away during the night in a state of confusion and that she had been searching for him since early morning. When Detective Rodriguez mentioned the security footage, Jessica's story began to fall apart completely. Under intense questioning, Jessica finally admitted to giving her father a large dose of prescription sleep medication in his evening coffee, but claimed it was only intended to help him sleep peacefully after their argument. She insisted that she had only planned to take him to the river to scare him into giving her access to his retirement accounts, not to actually harm him. According to Jessica's confession, her plan was to push Darryl's wheelchair to the water's edge and threaten to leave him there unless he agreed to withdraw the money she needed to pay off her gambling debts. She claimed that when she tried to wake him up to carry out her intimidation plan, she realized he wasn't responding normally to her attempts to rouse him. In her panic and desperation, Jessica made the fateful decision to push the wheelchair containing her unconscious father into the water, believing she could make his death appear to be an accidental drowning. She thought that without witnesses or evidence, no one would suspect that his death was anything other than a tragic accident involving an elderly man who had become disoriented. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Darryl had died from drowning, but also revealed a significant amount of prescription sleep medication in his system. The dosage was not immediately lethal on its own, but combined with his age, the stress of the situation and the cold water temperature, it had rendered him completely unconscious and unable to save himself when he entered the river. Jessica Peterson's trial began 4 months after her arrest, and as the prosecution's primary witness, I testified about the changes I had observed in both Darryl and Jessica during the months leading up to this tragedy. The prosecutor district attorney, Karen Walsh, presented a comprehensive timeline of Jessica's gambling addiction, her escalating financial demands, and her ultimately fatal decision to drug and threaten her father. The courtroom was packed with Pine Valley residents who couldn't believe that someone they had known since childhood could be capable of such a heinous crime against her own father. Jessica sat quietly at the defense table, looking nothing like the confident young woman who had left for college with such bright prospects 15 years earlier. The defense attorney attempted to portray Jessica as a desperate mother, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. They argued that gambling addiction was a recognized mental illness that had impaired her judgment and ability to make rational decisions. They claimed that Darryl's death was a tragic accident that occurred during what was meant to be an empty threat to secure money for her children's welfare. However, the evidence against Jessica was overwhelming and painted a clear picture of premeditation and callous disregard for her father's well-being. The security footage, the audio recordings Darryl had made, the digital trail of her gambling activities, and her own partial confession created a narrative that was impossible for the defense to refute or explain away. The jury heard testimony about Jessica's elaborate lies regarding her job search efforts, her manipulation of Darryl's love for his grandchildren, and her systematic theft of money from his accounts over a period of several months. Expert witnesses explained how gambling addiction typically progresses and the desperate measures addicts often take when their debts become unmanageable. The most compelling testimony came from Emma and Michael's teachers, who described how the children had frequently come to school hungry, wearing dirty clothes and showing signs of neglect. This testimony contradicted Jessica's claims that she needed money for her children's welfare, instead suggesting that she was prioritizing her gambling over their basic needs. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges. Jessica Peterson was sentenced to 25 years in prison for second-degree murder, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Additional charges for elder abuse theft fraud and child endangerment added another 5 years to her sentence. As the judge read the sentence, Jessica collapsed in her chair, finally seeming to comprehend the full magnitude of what she had done and the consequences she would face. The courtroom was silent, except for the quiet sobbing of family members and friends who had hoped against hope that somehow this nightmare would have a different ending. The most difficult moment for me personally was when Jessica was allowed to address the court before sentencing. Through tears and with a voice barely above a whisper, she apologized to her father's memory, to her children, and to everyone who had been affected by her actions. She admitted that her gambling addiction had consumed her rational thinking and transformed her into someone she didn't recognize. She spoke about the moment she realized her father was unconscious in the water and how she had panicked instead of immediately calling for help that might have saved his life. Jessica acknowledged that her selfish choices had not only killed the most loving and generous person in her life, but had also destroyed her children's sense of security and family stability. Following Jessica's conviction, I was formally appointed as the executor of Darryl's estate, a responsibility I accepted with deep solemnity and determination to honor his memory. The process of distributing his assets according to his final wishes became a way for me to ensure that his generosity and concern for others would continue even after his death. 3 years have passed since that terrible morning when I received the phone call about Darryl's death, and the journey from shock and disbelief to understanding and acceptance has been longer and more challenging than I ever imagined possible. In the immediate aftermath of learning the truth about how he died, I struggled with overwhelming anger toward Jessica and profound guilt about whether I could have done something to prevent this tragedy. The anger was the most difficult emotion to process and move beyond. I felt rage at Jessica's selfishness, her willingness to destroy the man who had given her everything, and her complete disregard for how her actions would affect her innocent children. There were many nights when I lay awake, replaying conversations, wondering if I had missed warning signs or failed to provide adequate support when Darryl needed it most. But gradually, through professional counseling and conversations with other families who had experienced similar betrayals, I began to understand that Jessica's gambling addiction had fundamentally altered her brain chemistry and her ability to make rational decisions. This understanding didn't excuse her actions or diminish the tragedy, but it helped me move past the consuming anger that was poisoning my own well-being and preventing me from healing. My recovery process was greatly aided by my continuing relationship with Emma and Michael. Linda moved to Pine Valley to provide stability for the children, and she brings them to visit me every other weekend. We spend time together, sharing stories about their grandfather, maintaining the traditions he had established with them, and creating new positive memories to help them cope with their loss. Emma, now 10 years old, has begun asking more complex and difficult questions about what happened to her grandfather and why her mother is in prison. These conversations are heartbreaking, but they've also shown me the remarkable resilience that children possess and the importance of providing them with honest, age-appropriate answers rather than protecting them from difficult truths. Michael, who is 8, seems to have adjusted well to his new life with Linda, but still occasionally asks when his mother will come home and why his grandfather had to go away. I've learned to answer these questions with patience and compassion, helping him understand that sometimes people make choices that hurt the people they love, even when they don't mean to cause harm. Through my work with the Darryl Peterson Foundation for Addiction Recovery, which was established using the majority of his estate, I've met dozens of families dealing with gambling addiction and elder abuse. These experiences have taught me that what happened to Darryl and Jessica is far more common than most people realize, and that financial abuse of elderly family members by adult children struggling with addiction is a growing problem. I've learned to recognize the warning signs that I missed in Jessica's behavior during those crucial months, the frequent financial emergencies with vague explanations, the increasing isolation from friends and extended family members, the mood swings that seemed disproportionate to normal stress, and the manipulation tactics that exploited Darryl's love for his grandchildren to override his better judgment. The most profound change in my perspective has been my understanding of the crucial difference between helping someone you love and enabling their destructive behavior. Darryl's generous nature which was one of his most admirable and beloved qualities, became a weakness that Jessica learned to exploit with devastating effectiveness. I now understand that love sometimes requires saying no, setting firm boundaries, and refusing to participate in behavior that ultimately harms everyone involved, even when it causes immediate pain and conflict. This lesson has changed how I interact with my own family members and friends when they face difficulties that might be solved with money or resources. I no longer feel guilt about what happened because I've come to understand that Darryl made his choices based on love, hope, and the belief that his support would eventually help Jessica overcome her problems and rebuild her life. Neither of us could have predicted the depths to which her addiction would drive her, or the violence she would ultimately be capable of committing against someone who loved her unconditionally. Sometimes the greatest act of love is seeking justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves, and ensuring that their memory is honored through actions that prevent similar tragedies from happening to other families. Darryl's story changed how I see trust family relationships and the complex dynamics of addiction forever. What would you have done in my place if you had discovered that someone you trusted had betrayed and murdered your best friend? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it made you think differently about the warning signs of addiction and family manipulation. Subscribe for more true stories that explore the complex realities of human nature and the importance of protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit their love and trust. Please share this video with someone who might benefit from understanding the devastating impact of gambling addiction on families, and remember that seeking help is always the right choice when addiction threatens the safety of loved ones. Thank you for listening to Darryl's story, and may you find the wisdom to balance love with healthy boundaries in all your relationships.